chose the theme debunking the myths, um, talking about what some of the the general public thinks about when they think about spiritual care and how that matches up with the reality from people out there practicing in the field in our community. Um, so in order to talk about some of those myths, we put together this series of webinars featuring some prominent spiritual healthcare providers here in Manitoba. Each one of the conversations is going to come at this from a bit of a different angle as we attempt to address and maybe break down some of those myths or stereotypes that people have when they hear the phrase spiritual healthcare. And today I'm joined for this conversation by Rabbi Matthew. He is the rabbi at the Simkin Centre. He's also a freelance rabbi. He's available for weddings, funerals, bar and bat mitzvahs. He came to this profession through not your typical route. He used to be a sports radio host for TSN for 6 years, and then he became a rabbi working at Zedek Synagogue for a few years before going freelance. He is married to Heather, who is a lawyer, and together they have two boys, Hugo 5 and Felix 3. So I'd like to thank Rabbi Matthew for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the conversation as we talk about diversity inclusion. Is spiritual health care for everyone? Thanks for joining me, Rabbi Matthew.
Trevor, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Um, so is spiritual care and psychospiritual therapy only for religious people or only for people of a particular faith?
I would say definitely not.
Okay.
I think that for a lot of people now, I work at an interesting place. I work at a personal care home that is an organization within the Jewish community. And as I tell a lot of people when I lead orientation for new staff here, no other personal care home in the province is going to have a rabbi role or a rabbi, period. Just this place.
Okay.
It's just because we have so many Jewish people. It's not exclusively, however, Jewish people who live here. Of our 200 residents, we have about 60% who are Jewish, 40% who are not. And that means that you've got right there built into my my congregation, if you could think of it like that, a mix of people who right there are different, have a different religious background. Then within the religious background of Jewish people, you'll probably have a lot of people who express how religious they are very differently. So right there, myself and the other spiritual care practitioners who work here, chaplains, whatever they sometimes go back between those two terms. If you came out with the approach that it's only for religious people, well, you're going to be unable to connect. So by definition, I think it's important to think of that. But also, I think in actual practice, I like to think of it like this. If you had a big circle that was spiritual care, I think of religious care as being a smaller circle within that. So everything that we would do that would be religious care, religious services, prayer, worship services to mark the weekly Sabbath, which is something in the Jewish calendar, or holidays. Those would all be examples of spiritual care too, but not all spiritual care is going to be religious. There's got to be room for addressing issues that plague everybody, regardless of their belief in God, their lack of a belief in God. Spiritual care is taking care of the spirit or the soul, feelings of hopelessness, fear, grief, loss, loneliness. I mean, I live in a place where most people, pretty much everybody who comes here leaves here at the end when they die, which means death is around. This is not a typical workplace. Most people, death is not part of their workplace or where they live, and yet it is here. And you have to be able to tackle and discuss those concepts with everyone because they affect everyone. Religion is sometimes, for a lot of people, maybe always, a choice. Okay. But the spiritual care, that affects everybody. So definitely not only for religious people, Trevor.
So how do you approach that then when a person identifies as not being religious, or says, I'm not spiritual, I'm not religious, this, I can't see how you could help me.
Well, one of the things I know from my colleagues is that they are trying to make more of they've created a program where people can study called clinical pastoral education that a
Mhm.
lot of people in these roles take to try and, I guess, give them the tools to deal with what you just asked me about. For me, a lot of it is kind of my lived experience working with people. I think
Mhm.
a lot of people, no doubt, come to spiritual care from a religious background. And I think that
Yeah.
just as there is an overlap in the fact that religious care is spiritual care, not the other
Mhm.
way, but I think that there's obviously skills and experience that you bring if you have a religious background that can really serve you. For me, I think that a lot of let's describe them as like Jewish teachings that I've picked up and gathered along the way, you can turn those into advice for a lot of people and present it in a non-religious way. I
Mhm.
mean, that's probably one of the tools for me, is to kind of think about, okay, this person has a crisis in their life or is dealing with something that is plaguing their soul, plaguing their spirit. Is there any kind of Jewish wisdom that can help me formulate an advice or a perspective for them that I don't have to say to them comes from Jewish wisdom? It's just
Right.
wisdom. But even backing up before that, I think that a lot of what makes spiritual care beautiful and also very tricky to describe is that it really comes down to human connection, connecting with people. The best way to tackle these kinds of issues that I mentioned that are spiritual care issues often comes down to starting with listening, being a person who talks very little and just lets the person on the other side get thoughts off their chest, get thoughts off their mind, express themselves. Half of the battle, often in dealing with complicated feelings or deep emotional problems, comes with just talking them through. So you don't have to have any kind of religious background, or I think a religious background would even maybe kind of hold you back from being just an honest and pure listener. Like that's
Or
where it starts for most of the people. I have people who come in here, Jewish, not Jewish, in my particular practice here at the Simkin Centre. Most of the time, it's trying to connect with them on a human level to understand what they're going through. And then that involves just letting them initiate the conversation, and me being the opposite of what I've been in this answer, which is talk, 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 talk.
yeah. So, it sounds like you have to, have a certain amount of flexibility, and that if you come at that, being too dogmatic, um, then that's, maybe not a recipe for success. If
Yeah.
that's the approach you take to spiritual care, and I'm hearing that's the difference between perhaps being a religious care provider, and being a spiritual care provider, is letting the person, take the lead really in what that's going to look like for them.
I don't
Listening.
think that it's because I don't think the answer for a lot of these issues has to be a God centered answer for the person on the receiving end. And in
Hmm.
fact, if you try to force a God centered answer, what we would call more of a religious answer, that's what I think of it as. And like if someone
Hmm.
said to me, one of the things that I remember when I was studying to become a rabbi, we talked about within the Jewish community, there's a lot of Jewish people who feel very connected to their Jewishness, their Jewish identity, but they would describe themselves as spiritual, but not religious.
Okay.
I don't think that this is unique to Judaism. I just know it from studying it when I was becoming a rabbi. And in those situations, you have to meet with all situations. You have to meet people where they are. If you try and force a God-centered answer, religious-centered answer on somebody, you're just going to drive them away. The whole
Hmm.
idea, I think, behind spiritual care is helping people feel. I always think that there's got to be some there's often some kind of like feeling of loneliness or isolation, either on its own or connected with those feelings.
Hmm.
No one else understands what I'm going through, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And the first step is to break down that barrier and to
Mm-hmm.
help someone and to have empathy and to connect and really try to understand what that other person is feeling and where their stress comes from.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that, reminds me of an acronym that I sometimes fall back on, love, to listen, to understand, and to validate people. And that sounds exactly what you're doing there is creating
Yeah.
space um, for folks, no matter what that might look like.
Yeah.
Um, so Manitoba is, increasingly diverse. People from all over the world are coming here to live and work. How can spiritual care be respectful of diverse cultural, religious, and spiritual backgrounds in a healthcare service or healthcare setting that serves all of Manitoba?
Well, I think it comes down to spiritual care. People who work in spiritual care always have to be learning as well. And I think what can guide you is both your own personal curiosity, sure, but you have to know the people you're serving. In my case, and for other spiritual care practitioners who would come to the Simkin Centre, you would have to have a very good handle on Jewish views on spirituality and religion,
Hmm.
because more of the people who live here are Jewish, but they're, as I mentioned, not exclusively, and certainly a huge portion of our residents are not. So it becomes important, I think, to understand and do the research, the reading into other cultures, religions, what we would call backgrounds.
Hmm.
The best way that I find, or the way that kind of works for me with that, I often try to find where there are similarities. So in Manitoba is a great example. I love when I hear stories because I'm not well versed in a lot of other religions.
Hmm.
I love hearing stories, for example, from Manitoba's or anywhere in Canada's Indigenous communities, another group of people who are very connected to spiritual, a lot of things that would be described as spiritual, more so connected also to nature,
Land.
um, to land, right? And a lot of the practices I often hear about, for example, surrounding death, there's a lot of similarities. And I find that, as much as a lot of people think, oh, these our religions are so different. And if you go looking for
Mhm.
differences, you'll find them. But I think if you go looking for similarities, you'll also find them. And I remember one specific one was someone was telling me about an Indigenous practice that when somebody passes away, you don't leave the body alone. This is a very Jewish thing as well. In fact, it's basically forbidden to leave somebody alone. And we try to have a burial as quickly as possible. And I use this as just as a small example of that when you live in a very culturally diverse place like Canada, like Manitoba, like Winnipeg, and you work in a field that touches on spirituality and religion and culture, you
Mhm.
have to be able to try and bring these things together, because probably all of them, and by that I mean the religions, the cultures, all of them have very similar messages, if not the same message at their core. So they should be able to be drawn upon in the same sort of way. I think that's the way I look at it for me. So I'm always trying to learn and to broaden what I'm familiar with in my work.
Mhm. But I think when we get to, the myths or breaking some of the myths surrounding spiritual care, that is one of them. That what you said maybe hasn't always been true for people's experience about being respectful of different backgrounds and trying to find commonality. And so it sounds like a shift has happened.
Oh,
Um,
I'm sure not. No, I think that this is spiritual care in general is a very, very tricky thing um to describe because it's very abstract, it's very broad, and you can't really measure it in the same way. Like one of my colleagues said, everybody who moves to Simkin, using it as an example, you know, think of them as suffering body, mind, and spirit. Body, we can measure that. We know how to, we understand that. People just kind of naturally understand. Doctors take care of your body. And I think even more in the last decade, we're understanding how people have to get help to take care of their minds, right? Mental health awareness has become very, very prominent. But soul or spirit care will forever be very difficult to measure, impossible to quantify, really. Like people say, it goes up and down. You know, I talk to people who let's say that they're in, like, it's always very vague terms. They're in a tough place. They're going through a lot of stuff. Okay, well, when you kind of hone in on what they're exactly dealing with, you can talk it through, but you can't give them a medicine that tomorrow you're on the right track, right?
Right.
Maybe tomorrow they are feeling better, but 2 days later they're not feeling better. And so you're dealing with a discipline right at the very beginning that that's a beautiful thing, but also a very, very challenging thing at the same time. Now, to take it back to this kind of question, I think that, I would imagine that spiritual care is it's always been a struggle to kind of define it. And therefore a shift needs to occur because people probably don't even really have a great understanding of what spiritual care even is. It's just not obvious.
I certainly didn't. I'm learning so much about this, and naturally, or feel that apprehension or that even that nervousness when even the topic gets raised, or about spiritual healthcare. Well, what does that mean? Like, what's going to happen? Or, fearing that you'll be judged, or, fearing that you're not going to live up to expectations, or that you're going to, be told exactly how to live your life, or, shamed, or, all those things go into it too, where, I don't necessarily feel that way when I'm thinking about mental health care or when I'm thinking about physical health care.
Right. It's, and so I'm not surprised to hear that in the back, someone would probably think, especially in the last, I would say, again, maybe decade or so, from what I understand, they're really like they're trying really hard to make spiritual care more defined, come up with education programs, a kind of a college, have terminology, help people. These things always help, right? But like within the Simkin Center's history, our spiritual health department started with, we have an organization that has a lot of Jewish people. We need someone to lead religious services because this is a Jewish home. Let's bring in a rabbi part-time to lead these services. It wasn't me. This is going back in history. Okay, well, somebody here is close to death. Somebody here is on end of life. The rabbi should probably go visit that person too. Yes, the rabbi will go. Somebody just moved in, and it's a woman, and her husband is dealing with terrible feelings of guilt from the fact that he knows he needs to move her in here, but every day he has to leave her here. Who should he talk to? Well, he should talk to the rabbi too, because and then it becomes more than just leading religious services. These things, there's been an evolution. It's not a science in the same kind of way. It's been an evolving process. And so when you say to me, that hasn't always been the case, my answer is like, yeah, for sure, because we're kind of, not in a bad or reckless way, but we are kind of trying to figure out things as we go to a certain degree, because of how broad and because of how all-encompassing spiritual care is. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's really good, actually, that we're open to being able to kind of help really everybody. Spiritual care is something, it's like medical care. It's for everyone. Some people don't want it. That's another issue. Some people are going to be, don't want to talk about things like that, which is natural, I think, too. But it's all part of it.
How do you broach, or how do you respond to those situations where you find someone who's resistant to having spiritual care provided?
I look at it as like again, something I said earlier, you have to meet every person on his or her terms. So for me, in the Simkin Center, they know I'm here as the rabbi. Like, they know that that's my job. I wear a kippah. I'm identifiable. I've got a name tag that says rabbi. So they know that I'm not a healthcare aide, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a social worker, I'm not in management. So people know who I am. But if I meet somebody who, it's very clear, like they don't want spiritual care, whatever that means, it's about kind of, let's use a term sort of flippantly. It's kind of like the long con. I don't mean it in a con kind of way, but
Mm-hmm.
you have to say, okay, you just have to develop a relationship with that person. And over time, you have to be a person who, when they finally do, whether it's out of desperation, whether it's out of a moment of what they perceive to be weakness because they've tried so hard to not need spiritual care, when they do, you will have fostered a positive relationship based on something that feels to them more social, more. And when I call it a long con, I don't mean it in the sense of anything more than just, I mean something that plays out over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the rabbi, they are a resident. We can be talking about their families or sports or music or the weather, but just talking, just developing
Mm-hmm.
a rapport, just developing a connection.
Mm-hmm.
I realize it. That is spiritual care. That is,
Mm-hmm.
I'm creating a community for them. I'm creating at least one person with whom they feel safe, with whom they
Mm-hmm.
feel, because earlier you asked kind of like, you talked about shame and about fear of sharing, because these are very complicated things to do. People perceive vulnerability as a bad thing a lot of times, and they don't want to let their guards down.
Yeah.
And it's way different to go in and see a therapist or a counselor and feel pressure like they're going to judge you, they don't know you, than it is to talk to somebody who, at least in some element, there's a level of being kind of a friend, or at least friendly.
Mm-hmm.
So someone comes to me, short answer, and says, I don't want spiritual care. My answer is like, sure, what else do you want to talk about?
Right.
We just talk
Right.
about something different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And through, because a lot of the ways that you provide spiritual care are through presence. So just by being a presence in this person's life and having them be in your office or be in their room, that's a connection, right? There are no bad connections. Well, maybe that's not true. You could say the
Yeah.
wrong thing, I'm sure. But for the most part, if as long as you're not offending anyone,
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are no bad kind of connections in the quest to provide spiritual care.
Yeah. I love that piece about
Yeah.
presence, just being there. You know, focusing on building relationships and stepping stones, and um maybe it'll lead to something, maybe it won't, but it's not going to harm someone by being friendly and having conversations and building community. um I just think that's a wonderful, gentle approach that people must really appreciate when you become involved with them.
I hope so. I know that sometimes it doesn't last for very long. Sometimes it only lasts for a few minutes, but sometimes
Hmm.
even you just meet somebody very quickly, and or you see them very quickly, and you say it, you tell a joke, or you say something that, sometimes people say very kind of casually, oh, that really made my day, but it actually can.
Hmm.
You see something funny, or humor is a big part of it for me. I mean, we talked about how I came from a background that is entertainment. I was on the radio dealing with
Hmm.
sports, so it wasn't news. It wasn't even really current affairs. It was sports. And
Hmm.
I used to wonder about what role does entertainment play, because I then became a rabbi in like the big picture and serious things. And sometimes people just need someone who makes them smile, someone who makes
Hmm.
them laugh, right? Like this is a. I work in an environment where we regularly get emails that somebody, or if you live here regularly, somebody that you saw a lot at meals
Hmm.
or who lived next door to you, all of a
Hmm.
sudden their health takes a turn for the worse and
Hmm.
they're in an end of life situation. Like that
Hmm.
happens. That happens very regularly here. So
Paramedics might be there frequently.
yeah, so
Yeah.
you need like some kind of, you need jolts of just, you know
Joy,
joy.
laughter.
Yeah, one of my colleagues said, it's very easy to think of a personal care home like ours as a place where people come to die,
Hmm.
because they do. Like that's a thing that happens here.
Hmm.
But just because that's true doesn't mean that you can't live your life when you're here. And the medicine obviously helps you do that, but spiritual care, that's, I think, ultimately the aim is not always to be going trauma and going sadness and going despair. I mean, it's often bringing life, humor, joy, music. I mean, I think a huge part of what helps me personally is that my mom forced me to play piano when I was a kid, and then I joined bands, and music is a big part of what I do. Music is a big part of Jewish services. They're very musical, and I think
Yeah.
they're very sung. And
Mhm.
I like to do concerts. I like to bring music to a small group. I like to bring music to a large group and do a concert. How many times have people said to you, have you heard people say, or maybe even you felt that when you were at a concert or you were listening to something, that you had a spiritual
Spiritual. Yeah.
experience?
Or described it as, oh, it was in a religious experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Because music hits your soul.
Hmm.
Music hits you in a way, but humor does that too.
Hmm.
Lots of things do that. And so um, that's what I see myself and my colleagues, both at Simkin and other personal care homes, doing as well, is just trying to make life worth living,
Hmm.
which when you're in a personal care home, that is a challenge.
Hmm.
That requires care,
Hmm.
attention, because
Hmm.
a lot of people who live in a personal care home don't want to live in a personal care home. So
Right.
right there, you have a spiritual
Hmm.
crisis, whether they're a religious person or not. Right there, you have a crisis.
Hmm. Yeah.
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 How do I make life worth living for this person?
Right.
Sometimes the answer is in God, and sometimes the answer is in what you've learned in your training. If you've got a theological background, as I do to a certain degree, being a rabbi, but it's not limited to that. And you can draw on that and you can find it, but you also have to meet people as humans, right? Like how do you brighten a person's day? And then how do you do it again? And how do you help them brighten their day, change their perspective? It's not always easy. And you can't ever know for sure if you've got it right. That's,
Yeah.
I think, a challenge too.
Mm. So we talked a little bit about, some of the general public's misconceptions about spiritual care. How about the rest of them, the multidisciplinary team? How do do you find you need to convince them of spiritual care's worth, or are they on board? Do they easily see it and see you as an essential part of that healthcare team?
I think at Simkin Center, yes. I don't think that there's a lot of to, you know, prove ourselves, because there are personal care homes that don't have spiritual health departments, but we do.
Hmm.
I came here as a rabbi that was part of an application that this place made for a grant to enhance spiritual care. There were
Hmm.
already two spiritual care providers here. Spiritual care was something that Simkin Center looked at and saw as there being value and wanting good people. And so we didn't have to convince anybody of that.
Yeah.
I think I'm not a doctor. I haven't spent any time other than the last year and a half working really in any kind of WRHA kind of place. But the sense that I get is that spiritual care people, because it's not measurable or quantifiable, or, you can't say this person died of a broken soul or broken
Right.
heart the way you can this person died of a peptic ulcer that ruptured. I feel like spiritual care professionals have always been defending themselves and battling and trying to prove that they belong, just because of the complicated nature of this work. I feel like there is a certain, my perspective, no judgment, I feel like there is a certain element of an inferiority complex, almost because they've
Mhm.
had to for so long be like, excuse me, we are important to be here. One of the questions that we kind of talked about was, what do we do if we decide there isn't a role for spiritual care in
Mhm.
in like in
Mhm.
healthcare? To me, that question is like, if I said to you, what do we decide if there isn't a place for medical care? Like,
Mhm.
it's, to me, it is that absurd. But
Okay.
no one feels it that absurd, right? Like, you would never think of taking the doctors out of a personal care home and making it
Right.
just a bunch of chaplains. You
Uh-huh.
would never do the opposite. But yet we would actually toy with the idea of saying, let's just have the doctors. Who's going to deal with with despair, loneliness? Who's going to inject life? Who's going to never mind the religious services? Like, imagine it was a completely non-denominational place. Who are you going to talk to when a husband drops off his wife and says, I need to go talk to somebody because I don't want to go home right now, but I can't see my wife. That's not for the doctor.
Right.
That's not for the social. Like, how could you even really fathom about taking that away? And so I think spiritual care people are like exhausted and probably just kind of like at some points feel like they need to give up because they've constantly been trying to prove that we're all here on the same team. We're all trying to take care of people from different angles, right? It's just some things are more obvious than others. And well, it's kind of the way it is. But there is, as a result, I think built into the profession, there is a certain element of kind of like, we're always constantly trying to prove that we belong here, which is why Spiritual Health Awareness Week, I think that's part of why it exists, but also why it needs to exist, right? People. Right. And I find that this is one of these things that it makes a lot of sense when you talk to people, when you hear it, like, yeah, of course, but we don't immediately think of it the way we do, like, oh man, my father is moving into a personal care home. I really hope the doctor and the nurses know what to do for him. You know, your first thought is doctor and nurses, healthcare aides, the food. And then somewhere down the line, it's just like, oh yeah, who's going to talk to him about the fact that like, he doesn't want to leave his room every day?
I hope they have a world-class team of spiritual healthcare providers.
Right.
Maybe not the first criteria.
Right. But like when you break it down, you really can't conceive of losing that. Particularly when I think it's another thing too, where you have to see it play out over a long time. You know, and when I first started here, in my first weeks, my first months, you're trying to learn everyone's name. You're trying to like have everyone learn your name. But a year later, a year and a half later, you realize that you've developed relationships that have had, you know, interactions and stops throughout that period of time. And you know people, right? Like part of spiritual care, you can't provide spiritual care like we were talking about earlier until you have a connection. You can't walk into a room and be like, you and I now have a connection. Tell me your deepest, darkest fears. Let's talk about your parents. Well, right? You can't walk off.
That even brings me back to like you're talking about being entertainer. You have to warm the audience up first. Yeah. You can't just any public speaker or any entertainer knows that you have to, you can
walk into a doctor's office and say, doctor, my foot is bothering me. Right. And he can take a look at it or call for an x-ray, or she can call for an x-ray, and there can be progress. Spiritual care, it often requires, like, it has to play out over a very long time. And in our society in general, more and more and more with every day, people want it as fast as you possibly can, right? It's a discipline that will never be like that.
Yeah, it's not meant for TikTok. It's no,
it's not. It's meant
that's
for.
Why that's why I think
a cake over time.
It's a harder sell because we've said it takes place over a long period of time. The results aren't necessarily quantifiable. It's they're going to vary from person to person. They're so making that point or getting the general public and funders and policy makers to say this needs to have a central role in any kind of healthcare setting, but especially for people in the long-term care setting.
Exactly. I was just looking through some of my notes. I mean, while it's funny because it's not quantifiable at all, really, on a day-to-day kind of thing. But if you measure, like I was reading, in preparation, going through some old studies that I had been handed down in the last 5 years, institutions that have spiritual care providers, over a period of time, they can measure and find that there are decreased stress levels. There's enhanced mental health for residents. Like, it's one of those things that when it's present, when there's spiritual care, the residents benefit.
Yeah.
Like they have been, like, you can't necessarily measure each
Hmm.
person's benefit, but as a collective,
Or
right?
necessarily tie it back to
Yeah,
good spiritual health care. Oh, that's the reason that that's
you're
happening.
right. It's not a
Yeah,
one-to-one kind of thing.
yeah.
But when there is spiritual care, and then when there's good people, good listeners, empathetic
Mhm.
people, people who, have, then it comes down to like a lot of kind of things, personalities who click, all that kind of stuff. When you have good people too, like I believe we do at Simkin, it just, it's one of those things in the building, like you just, in the organization, you just feel it. It becomes like a culture, a morale thing, like the place, it all becomes, that's a hard thing to
It
describe too.
permeates the whole
It permeates the whole.
environment, you know.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. And I think that spiritual care is a part of that. The department that we're kind of in slash next to is therapeutic recreation,
mhm,
right? The people who are constantly bringing games, bringing
mhm,
things that, that's celebrations, birthday parties, music. Like we're all in that. It's that those are the things that, like you said, the things that permeate the place,
mhm.
and then things that you become known for, reputation. Like it's the Simkin Center is a place where, and then spiritual care is part of that. It's a beautiful thing, actually. It's really, really beautiful, and it's very important. I've learned so much about it since I started working here. I think spiritual care is probably as neglected as anything for most people. You just, because who do you go to?
Well,
And
and just over the
if you're
course,
not a religious person
mhm,
and you have like an everyday life, who's your spiritual care provider? Right? You've got a doctor, you've got a dentist, you've got, you don't really have
mhm,
somebody on your speed dial that you call when you're feeling down.
mhm, yeah.
Maybe family, maybe friends, but not like a professional in the same sort of way.
Mhm. Yeah, and over the course of the week that I've been having these conversations, I'm coming to have a deeper appreciation. And when I think about, oh, maybe one day I'll be in that situation. Now I'm hopeful that they do have a strong spiritual healthcare team and its
Yeah.
value. And if those folks aren't present, then who's going to be there for me, like to look after that piece, not in the religious aspect, which I think that was the lens that I looked at it through. But no, who's going to have those conversations with me? The doctors and nurses, well, they can be overwhelmed and busy, and
Yeah.
of course, they're kind and they would love to, but they can't do that. This role that you're describing for spiritual healthcare is, absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm. It
Yeah.
is. It really is. And it's important, I think, for people to know that, for people to think about it, to know about it. Yeah, it's great.
Mhm.
I'm glad that you've had such a Trevor, that you've had such an eye-opening experience as part
Mhm.
of this the interviews. At the very least, that's a huge win.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, now you can, as you said, but it seems obvious, right? That what a strong role there needs to be for that presence, and that makes me, you know, worried for some places or some areas where they might not be present. Well, who's helping that person? Who's there for them? Who's talking to them about grief or loss, or who's talking to them about fears of what happens next, or who's making them feel welcome and comfortable and like this is a home and not just a healthcare setting. Yeah, who's
Yeah,
doing that? Who's doing that?
exactly.
Yeah.
It's if that role isn't around, who is doing that? Somebody
Hmm.
who is out of their element
Hmm.
doing it, and then somebody who's doing it reluctantly, somebody's not doing it at all. What
Hmm.
ends up happening in that situation that you describe, which is a concern, is when the answer to that your question is kind of looking around the room and eventually settling on, well, nobody. That's That's not a
Mm,
good thing. That's a disaster that you're
mhm,
describing. It's in a setting that I live in. If there was nobody around who could be able to address concerns on the meaning of life and death, and not to provide answers, but to just even just be present, like we were saying, that's a big void
mhm.
that's not around.
Because I know that, right now there's more and more attention to being paid to loneliness. The World Health Organization has, targeted that as an area of concern. And if we only focus, as you said, what if we took the spiritual healthcare providers out and only focused on physical health? Well, if we're able to ensure that somebody could live 5 years longer, that's great. But what if they're not in 5 enjoyable years for people because no one's, they're anxious, they're lonely, they're sad, they're depressed. Like, is that the goal? Is just to, make sure people, that their health needs are met and that they're living as long as possible and not paying attention to what the quality of those years, that time is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that would
I
be a
don't know.
concern.
I don't know. Is it better to live longer
Mhm.
but have the years suck more?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
don't. My intellectually, my answer to that has got to be no. There's got to
Uh-huh.
be a way to live longer and have the years be better.
And have the years. Yeah,
Yeah, there's got
both.
to be. That's my positivity, I guess.
So there needs to be both. Yeah,
There
exactly.
needs to be
Yeah.
both. Yeah,
So
and that's the thing too, is that a quote unquote perfect world, at least from what we're talking about, spiritual care and healthcare are working side by side,
mhm,
in harmony, because everyone's got the same goal,
mhm,
and no one really needs to step on anybody's toes. Like
mhm,
spiritual care shouldn't get in the way of healthcare, and healthcare
mhm,
shouldn't get in the way of spiritual care, and they shouldn't try to provide what they aren't.
mhm.
I think it can work. I see it work really well at the Simkin Centre where I am, but that's mostly because I recognize that I'm not a nurse or a doctor, and I stay out of their way.
Mhm. What about people who may not be taking advantages of the services that you might offer because they don't think that spiritual healthcare is inclusive, that, maybe they come from a different background, maybe they might be part of a community like the gay or lesbian community or a different uh, you know, cultural background, and they say they're not going to want me. And so they just turn off. Like, how do we reach those folks?
Yeah, you have to try again with some of the tips from before, but it's like someone who says they're not spiritual or anything, whatever the reason. You have to just try, and for me, I just try and connect on a very personal level, and hope that in time they'll come back to me.
Yeah.
It's one of those
For
things.
people who might, religion or the idea of spirituality was actually something that might have hurt folks.
Yeah,
You talked about the
that's
indigenous
okay.
community, the gay community, that, other religious minorities. Like, how do we reach those folks?
I don't think you'll ever convince. I don't think you'll ever convince anybody of anything by walking up to them and being like, "Trust me." Like, you can't convince them that way. I
Hmm.
think you have to go into it with the understanding that they may never want to have a conversation about that with you.
Hmm.
But the only chance you ever have of getting that person to open up to you is to demonstrate to them, I believe, over a period of time, that if it's me, that
Hmm.
if anyone were going to be a safe religious person that they could open up to, it's me.
Hmm.
Because I can't go to them and be like, okay, we've had 17 positive encounters. I think you're ready now to tell me about the childhood trauma that you experienced with that priest. And I'm a rabbi, so I'm a good guy, and we've
Hmm.
become friends. And so now it's time. Like,
Hmm.
you have to be prepared that they will never come to you. But the
Hmm.
only way they would ever maybe come to you is if you, by being you, break down all those potential barriers that they could have, understanding that I don't think you can ever ask them, come on, come and open up to me. No, I don't think so. And I don't think you can ever be sure that they will. You just have to kind of hope. There has to be a certain You like this? There has to be a certain element of faith,
Yeah.
I think, in them, like
Mhm.
you can't force it. You
Mhm.
try and force that sort of thing on anyone. You try and force them into a conversation. You try and trick them into a conversation. You're not approaching it in the right way. You can't be like truly organic. Like you have to show them that you are a person.
Organic.
You just have to try and demonstrate to them that you won't judge them, that you'll be curious, not judgmental, that you'll be
Mhm.
supportive and open and a listener.
Mhm.
And then it's up to them. Like you have to ultimately give them the choice. But for
Mhm.
someone who had a negative religious experience, that is somebody who I'm dying to talk to,
Really?
because I want them to see that I think that that's awful that they went through. I want them to understand that I want to hear what they went through if they want to talk about it, and I want to help them realize that there are religious and spiritual people like me who aren't like that person, and that if that was something that they would ever open their mind to again, that there are people who I think they could feel safe with. That's a hard thing. I mean, like a trauma
Mhm.
from the past, that's a very, very tough thing to switch someone's opinion or feeling on. It's not even an opinion. It's just kind of like it's in them. It's you, right. But I want to try and help. I always hate when religion is the answer for something that is ultimately a negative thing. Certainly, like war is a great example on an extreme level, but
Mhm.
even something maybe on a smaller level, like I don't attend church because I just had this terrible time, or whatever. Don't attend synagogue. That'd be more for me because I hated
Mhm.
the rabbi or whatever. That is a person I really do want to hear their story, because someone who's just got like no religion is pretty open, I think, and you can maybe connect with them. But somebody who's got a negative feeling of religion, I worry. I just, like I said, I want to try and help if I can remove that. Like I don't want religion. I don't think should ever be connected to something that is bringing somebody down, holding them back, whatever that means. And so, because of the nature of my background, I guess part of me is always trying to fix it, and maybe you can't. But I am always very interested in people who have had negative experiences, to try and, well, I guess like anything, to try and help undo that. But
Mhm.
that's a big ask sometimes. So maybe I'm naive a little bit,
No,
but
but I understand, I think, and appreciate what you're saying, and that the effort that you want to make that effort. And yeah, you maybe can't in the end, maybe for some cases, undo some of that, but that your willingness is to be there, and that those are the people that you know also really want to talk to. That's really hopeful and encouraging.
yeah,
And
I think so. Yeah, I'm not,
yeah,
certainly wouldn't
I
back
don't.
down
I
from.
think you're right. I don't think there would be any other way that you could do it or approach it. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
There you go.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to you. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I
Oh,
feel
thanks.
really grateful that there are people like you out there doing this work, and I feel like the residents of the Simkin Center are in really good hands. And yeah, thank you for
I
joining
hope
us.
so, and I appreciate the time. Like I said, bringing awareness to this is really helpful. So thank you to all the people you've talked to and will continue to talk to,
Yeah.
and for the work you're doing. Appreciate it, Trevor.
Okay. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Yes, thank you. You too. Be well.